Hello, I'm Austin,
And I'm Kyle.
and welcome to Splash Course in U.S. History. Today we're going to be talking about the history of the economic social class in America.
Throughout United States history, the social class present has evolved and taken up many different forms. In order to understand the diverse history of the United States, it is also important to grasp the economic and social class structure of individuals. As the American identity and sense of social culture evolved, so did economic opportunities that a person could undertake. Changes in the social class can be pinpointed to key events that caused a change either directly or indirectly in these class structures. These events led to new economic opportunities for some and took away from others. Either way, the American social structure was directly impacted by these events, and in order to comprehend American history, an individual must understand these events and how it affected social class structure and social mobility.
So, the very first inhabitants of America were the Native Americans. Before 1492, these people were the dominant civilization. Social structure did play an important role in traditional Native American societies. Although there were no traditional written rules or complex governments, there was a defined structure and social norms that people were expected to follow if they wanted to be a functioning part of society. At the highest level, there were the tribes and the nations. These were large groups of people that had culture, geography, and language in common.
Which within each tribe were a smaller group called clans, similar to families. The members of the clan typically shared common ancestors and were usually related to one another. Each clan had its own symbol or spirit that gave the clan its name. Many of the clan names were animals, but not all of them.
The leaders of the clans and tribes were called chiefs. These men were elected or chosen by the people, and they almost always did not have total power, but they were very respected men who provided advice that the tribe or clan generally followed.
However, this all began to change in 1492. After Columbus's discovery of America, the country quickly began to change into one of the colonial powers.
Obviously, one of the biggest events that changed American social class was the establishment of colonies. This was the first big step in economic change due to an influx of immigrants that would shape America in their image. Despite the colonies seeming as if there were no social structure, some individuals were put into higher esteem than others. Many people who came up from Europe in the hopes of gaining social mobility did not receive it. And at the same time, many wealthy individuals from Europe that did come over remained rich, and poor remained poor. Even though America was seen as the land of opportunity, gaining ground for social advancement was very difficult for most people.
To understand this, we have to look back at Europe during the same time period. At the top were the nobles, then we had the gentry, yeoman farmers, and the poor and often landless whites.
Many nobles did not actually come to America. Because they were well off, there was no reason for them to. Oftentimes, the gentry and the second sons would come to America. These second sons would not inherit their family land, and many of them wanted to have a chance to start their own family and get a chance to start some riches. In addition, many yeoman farmers would come over with the same intentions to move up in social class. Then, finally, landless whites would come over as indentured servants in the hopes of gaining land and or freedom.
Thus, because of this, the social class went as follows. First, we have the upper class. These people were often wealthy second sons coming from aristocrats from Europe. They had the most say in public offices. Middle class came next. They are often educated gentry and consisted of doctors and lawyers. They also could hold public office. At the bottom we had poor farmers, then servants, and a few blacks.
The great distinction between these classes can be seen in the autobiography of a man named Devereux Gerat, who talks about his experience with the gentry as an inhabitant of the lower classes. He says, "We were accustomed to look upon what were called gentlefolk as beings of a superior order. For my part, I was quite shy of them and kept off at a humble distance. A wig, in those days, was a distinguishing badge of the gentlefolk, and when I saw a man riding in the road near our house with a wig on, it would so alarm my fears and give me such a disagreeable feeling that, I dare say, I would run off for my life." Such ideas of the difference between gentlefolks and simple were, I believe, universal among all of my rank and age. Compared to the original native structure, the colonial one started the shift of power from natives to colonists. In addition, it started the change to a patriarchal society which would take years to dissipate.
The next big event that changed the economic class structure in America was the Revolutionary War. With this war came a change in the mindsets, which would then prove to change the economic class. The idea of republicanism, that people could vote for who goes into office, was revolutionary at this time. This was a stepping stone towards universal white manhood suffrage. Granted, voting rights themselves do not change the economic class. The ability to vote does allow you to put people into office who can change your social status.
Well, the Revolutionary War did not directly change the economic class. However, it did bring up the origins of America and the mindset of Americans. The idea of voting for who rules the country allowed for certain individuals to gain power that would in turn give or take power from other people. This war also established who could have power. It was limited mostly to a few whites. Women could not vote at all, even in many churches. They were entrusted with Republican motherhood, the concept that they must raise their children to be smart, law-abiding citizens. Unfortunately, women did not receive the respect they deserved for all this work. Minorities also similarly reaped no benefits. After leaving Britain, the Proclamation Line of 1763 was completely ignored, and blacks also received no benefits, as well as the Constitution, having slavery mentioned in it, making it part of this new government.
The argument could be made that the American Revolution did not have a big impact on the economic class. However, the idea of republicanism shaped the mindset of the nation. In addition, the establishment from local governments to a central one took away the power on the local level. There was a large poor agricultural class, 90% of people were small farmers, and there was a very small wealthy class. The war also set the foundation of where minorities stood in the nation.
You see, wars in general are fantastic catalysts for social and economic change, not only because of the enormous amount of money that goes into war, but also because of the ideals that are brought up in the conflict, as well as the demographic shifts that occur.
The next great shift in the economic and social class came with the War of 1812. Along with the Embargo Act, the War of 1812 greatly changed the factory system and led to the booming Industrial Revolution. With the non-interaction that the war was fought over, the factory sector in America experienced an upsurge because imported products were replaced with American-made ones. This extended later as well as after the War of 1812. After the war, there was a more plentiful labor supply as not as many soldiers were required. They could return to the labor force and contribute to the greater factory production, and more women began moving.
Let's recap. The natives had a local government structure, which for the most part, each individual was equal in social standing. However, after the arrival of colonists, the natives were on the bottom of the social hierarchy, following the lower class, along with the blacks, the servants, and the immigrants. The class structure then went towards a patriarchal society. Wealth was accumulated within the rich white population, and minorities got their rights and land taken away from them. For the beginning of American history, there was mainly just a lower, a middle, and an upper class. The middle class, however, was very limited and small. With the birth of the Industrial Revolution, this began to change.
The Industrial Revolution started in 1791 when Samuel Slater, a textile worker from England, came over and is now considered the father of the American factory system. Samuel Slater took plans from a factory system in England and then started an American factory in Rhode Island. At the same time, many new inventions came out that would aid the industry, one of the most famous ones being Eli Whitney and interchangeable parts. After the War of 1812, America had to fuel its own industrial growth. With the birth of the American factory system and industry came a new change in the economic class. This was the arrival of the working class. For the first time in American history, there were less people living in rural and more people living in an urban setting. What did this mean for the economic social class?
As continually seen in American history, people who are poor will remain poor. The Industrial Revolution did much to help the upper middle class, but limited the working class. In some respects, the working class benefited because of increased social mobility. But with the rise of the industry also began the rise of the middle class. In addition to the middle class, the working class also expanded. The middle class expanded due to the fact that new opportunities were opened in business and management. As far as the economic social class goes for the working demographic, there are many pros and cons. A good thing for them was the increased job opportunity. While the work was long and laborious, it allowed for people to gain a source of income, which was better than nothing. This further expanded the working class. While it was looked at as essentially wage slavery, and an individual was stuck in a terrible cycle of going to work for a little pay and then going to sleep, it still expanded the economic opportunities. In addition, it allowed women to get a role in the economic class. Now their domain increased from Republican motherhood to working in textile factories. Immigrants, especially the Irish, now also had the opportunity to increase their social class by working in industry.
With the birth of industry, we see a huge change in the social class. Women and immigrants now had the ability to achieve economic status, even though social mobility was limited. In addition, there was an expanded working class and now a growing middle class.
For the individuals that did not go towards the city, many people looked westward in hopes of attaining some status. Westward expansion had a huge role on economic status. A widely accepted view of the importance of westward expansion was expressed in the thesis of someone named Frederick Jackson Turner, who argued that the frontier is the key factor in the development of American democracy and institutions. A good example is the breaking down of social lines through the Homestead Act, which gave 160 acres to everyone. This allowed all people, whether they be blacks, whites, women, or immigrants, to take a stake to the land. Unlike before, when the rich had much more land than the poor, everyone now was on a slightly more equal playing field. This separates us from the way Europe worked because America now had diverse economic mobility. In return, it shaped the American identity because everyone could achieve success.
In 1861, the Civil War began. For the majority of Southern's history, they had a planter aristocracy. The social class was determined by the number of slaves you owned. A little over 1,000 families actually owned over 100 slaves. As you go down the social hierarchy, individuals have less and less slaves. The absolute bottom of the economic class were free blacks. The majority of whites did not own slaves, and by free blacks being on the bottom, these slaveless or landless whites were then given an advantage in the social class because they were not on the complete bottom. However, post-Civil War, not only would the social structure of the South change, but also the structure of the whole nation.
With the conclusion of the war, there were some obvious effects. First of all, slaves were now freed men. One problem was that blacks had no way to get land, jobs, or education. While blacks were now free, that did not give them entitlement to the same freedoms many whites had. Even though the South was a Christian society, the Bible was used to condone slavery, which allowed masters to hurt their slaves without divine repercussions. Around the same time, a big step towards social mobility was an increase in education, which started around the same time. This was important because better education allows for better paying jobs, and more able voting, which allows an individual to accumulate more wealth. However, this did not occur for blacks. In response, there was an increasing middle class while the lower class was being left behind, with minorities. After the Civil War, the nation was able to begin social mobility similar to what the West had, where everyone was equal in their abilities to obtain wealth. In addition, the South was in an economic cycle that relied completely on slavery. After the emancipation, the South was capable of industrializing too, which expanded the working class and the earlier expressed wage slavery.
The next large change in the social class, which is often contributed as being a part of the Industrial Revolution, was Henry Ford's invention of the Model T and the assembly line along in it in 1908. The assembly line is a system for carrying an item that is being manufactured past a series of stationary workers who each assemble a particular portion of the finished product. Henry Ford made an incredible impact on the growth of the economy as well in terms of a lot of money coming in from the business. He introduced a division of working tasks and specialization of the workforce, so they became specialized in one part of the production, and this increased productivity.
In those days, each car was built from the frame up on stationary wooden horses. There was a different crew for each car, and the same crew stayed on the car until it was finished. That meant duplication of effort and a lot of time wasted. So they tried moving the men from car to car. Each man had a special job to do, and as soon as he finished it, he moved on to the next car and did the same thing there. That was better, but it still took 12.5 hours to assemble each Model T. Henry Ford watched it for a while, then he had an inspiration. Instead of moving the men past the cars, why not move the cars past the men? So on one hot August morning, they tried it that way. A husky young fellow put a rope over his shoulder, and Henry Ford called, "Let's go." And at that very moment, as the workmen began to fasten the parts onto the slowly moving car, the assembly line was born. A technique that was to revolutionize mass production all over the world. Once they found that the idea would work, they began to improve it, refine it. They rolled a chassis down a single line of track, pushing it from crew to crew. And the more expert they became at this new method, the faster the cars came off the assembly line, and the price of the Model T began to drop.
The result of this was the start of automobile culture, where many American families had cars and much more access to transportation. This new culture radically changed the U.S. economy, including the housing, transportation, and tourism industries, and gave lower classes, as well as the middle classes, a much larger role in just about everything. This led to an increase in the working class. As other companies incorporated the assembly line, more and more workers were needed, thus expanding the workforce.
As the 1930s came rolling around, the global Great Depression hit hard. Very few Americans were prepared economically, especially because of the rise of consumerism, all the new products that were emerging, and the advent of items being bought on credit rather than fully upfront.
The Depression hit the lower classes the hardest. Rapid, unplanned urbanization, fueled by the industrialization of America, led to all these poor lower-class Americans living in tall, narrow tenement buildings in terrible conditions such as dark, overcrowded, squalid, and just congested neighborhoods. People living in poverty suffered from the effects of unemployment, such as tons of homelessness, inadequate housing, hunger, family breakdown, exclusion from their community, and poor health, all which led to the negative social effects of that era. This can be seen in the document Afternoon in a Pushcart Peddler's Colony, an account which documents some of the deplorable things people were driven to do. It reads, "These men earned their living by cruising the streets long before daylight, collecting old automobile parts, pasteboard, paper rags, rubber, magazines, brass, iron, steel, or clothes, or anything they can find that is saleable as junk. They wheel their little pushcarts around exploring cellars, garbage cans, and refuse heaps. When they have a load, they turn their footsteps in the direction of the American Junk Dealers Incorporated, whose site of wholesale and retail operations is located directly opposite the pushcart colony at 143rd Street and Park Avenue. Of the 50-odd colonists, many are ex-carpenters, painters, brick masons, auto mechanics, upholsterers, plumbers, and even an artist or two. However, salvation came to America in the form of the New Deal, a series of programs made by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to combat the crippling economic depression. He created a number of special agencies that provided jobs for millions of workers, and wages that saved millions more in their desperate families. It also recognized the rights of workers to organize in unions, a large step for the roles of average working Americans. He also set up the Social Security system, giving those of all social classes more stability and increasing the number of people with stable jobs. In FDR's 7th Fireside Chat, he states, "Provisions for Social Security, however, are provisions for the future. Our responsibility for the immediate necessities of the unemployed have been met by Congress through the most comprehensive work plan in the history of the nation. Our problem is to put to work 3.5 million employable persons now on the relief rolls."
Following the New Deal in 1933, Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese in 1941, which is widely accepted as the main cause of the United States joining World War II. As the men went off to go fight in the war, women found themselves working in industry again on a larger scale. At the conclusion of World War II, many women still had the opportunity to keep their industrial jobs, which now allowed women to join the social class. However, other individuals in the lower class did not get the same opportunities. African Americans, despite attempts from the executive branch, were discriminated throughout the military and workforce. This unfortunately led to many blacks being unable to achieve more social liberties. The main economic cause which came out of World War II was once again the growth of the middle class. The U.S. was the biggest winner of the war and achieved economic prosperity. The U.S. was out of the Great Depression, and the amount of wealth within the household was increased. Coupled with the economic growth was a new rise in education with the help of the GI Bill. People began to move from the cities to the suburbs, and the amount of people in the middle class was at an all-time high.
After the changes that the end of World War II brought, as we just described, moving into the 1980s and present day, America began to settle back down. Despite the great increase in homeownership that the 1990s brought, and the increase in average income per person, the middle class remained the largest by far. And the top fifth of all American households held over half of the income. Despite being among one of the largest and most industrialized nations in the world, it came to rest with the largest gap between lowest and highest paid workers in the nation, and with the largest concentration of wealth at the top, almost identical to those of the Gilded Age.
As America grew as a nation, its social class began to change. Looking at modern day, many of the parallels from earlier in American history still exist today. One trend is that if you are poor, you will remain poor. One reason why minorities and immigrants are in lower classes is because once they find themselves there, it is very hard to increase your status. Due to this, where money is currently is affected by where it was, and it will continue to affect where it will go. The American identity is characterized by social mobility and the idea that if somebody works hard for what they want, they will attain it. However, if history of America proves one thing, that is while the nation is founded on hard work, people who are more privileged will get further ahead, while those who are not as privileged will not get as far. All right.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank old Gregory here, this maple syrup, this ship right here, my partner, Kyle Breault.
Thanks. That's this week's edition of Splash Course
In U.S. history.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
keep splashing.